it's fitting that that we're following Todd Boehly because you have become a recent co-owner of a team, Leeds United, I believe.
Yes, go Leeds, go.
And you have a playoff game coming up tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow.
Who do you play?
We play Norwich City in the championship playoffs.
But you're going to miss it.
I'm going to miss it because I'm going to be on a plane. So if you're on Air Qatar, please make sure that the Wi-Fi works tomorrow.
Right. So let's set the context for our discussion here. There was a New York Times Siena College poll that came out last week that showed that Joe Biden is behind Donald Trump in 5 of 6 key, what we call battleground states that are all absolutely critical for him to win re-election. Not all, but there's a narrow path, right?
That's right.
So he won all 6 of these in 2020, and now he's behind in 5 of them, some quite substantially. In Nevada, Trump is at 50%, Biden 38%. Georgia, 49% for Trump, Biden 39%. Pennsylvania, key state, Trump is ahead 47% to Biden's 44%. And the surveys of the discussions with voters around those results show that it's cost of living, inflation, immigration concerns, Gaza, and a general kind of desire for change that are hurting Biden. So given all of that, how worried are you? How panicked are you about what's going to happen in November to the Democratic nominee?
Well, look, I'm not that worried, in part because when I ran President Obama's campaign, what you realize is the hardest part are the polls, the daily back and forth, and usually the incumbent trails. At this exact day, Barack Obama trailed, Donald Trump trailed when he lost, George Bush trailed. Incumbents around the world are not popular right now.
Right.
So I'm not as worried, and I also think when you look at the polls, you know, I used to tell people in the Obama campaign, if you talk to me about a poll, I will fire you. Because we're 174 days out. Why do you care about polls? Now, you know, I'm not saying that the polls are great for the president, because they're not. But when you look at what Joe Biden needs to do to win, it really is giving a very direct contrast. How he beat Trump the first time was being very clear on what Joe Biden would do and what Donald Trump would do. And that contrast has not yet been made. Trump came through his primary sailing through. Voters haven't started focusing on him yet. And so all that's going to happen. And I think even in the last month, you've seen the tightening of the polls. Not that I look, Mark, because I don't.
Right.
But, you know, I just don't think, you know, you can look at the polls. The other thing is, in the United States, we had this massively controversial Supreme Court decision about abortion.
Right.
And since that case, Democrats have done 9% better than the polls because a whole lot of Republican women are now voting for Democrats in these local elections. Democrats have just swept up around the country since that thing. And I don't think that's factored in the polls as well. That said, this is not a wonderful time to be an incumbent. I'm advising several candidates around the world in their presidential elections, and you'd rather be the challenger than you would the incumbent right now for a variety of reasons that you and I will talk about.
Right. And just for context, Jim managed the campaign of the last Democratic president to win re-election, which of course was Barack Obama. And as you say, there were challenging moments in the Obama campaign, but wasn't he consistently ahead for most of it, except for maybe a period in October?
We trailed until June.
Okay.
And then Romney
and the nominee at that point was Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney, who now seems like a completely normal human who'd be very different than President Trump. And at the time was an incredibly difficult opponent. And we trailed him the entire spring and took the lead in the summer, and then held on to win. Right.
So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what we might think could be the reasons why that the president is trailing so badly. To me, one of the most interesting dichotomies in this race is, you know, by many indicators, Biden's economic record is actually pretty good.
Yep.
I mean, there even after adjusting for inflation, U.S. GDP is up 7% since early 2020. The stock market has hit record levels. U.S. unemployment is at or near historic lows. He has passed multiple ambitious pieces of legislation with a very difficult Congress situation to work with, but the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, which is about manufacturing chips in the United States, bipartisan infrastructure bill. Huge amounts of money are now pouring into these infrastructure projects in the United States, semiconductor manufacturing, against a backdrop of Donald Trump on trial in New York in a fairly tawdry case. So how
I like your framing of the election.
And yet we see Donald Trump leading consistently in the polls. So how do you explain what's going on?
Well, look, I think a couple things. American elections are economic elections, usually. When I was running Obama's campaign at 2 o'clock in the morning every month, Bill Clinton would call me up in the middle of the night and say to me, all presidential elections are always a referendum on the economic future of the country.
Right.
Mark, this might be the first election where that's not true.
You think?
It could be, because if you look at the campaigns both parties are running, and I'm not involved in either campaign, and I can talk about it on TV and be happy about it, so I'm not being partisan here, but Democrats are talking about abortion, Republicans are talking about immigration, both sides are trying to get into the economic issues. Voters, a reminder that America is now the most partisan country in the world. Only about 8% of Americans could vote for both Trump and Biden. 92% have already decided who they're voting for.
Right.
So we're competing over a very small group of people. And right now, the view with those voters is that Trump is better on the economy. And so Biden's challenge is to catch up on that economic number and basically get to parity. This will also be the first election in American political history where neither candidate gets to 50% approval rating. Barack Obama got to 50% in October of 2012, and I knew we had the election won because 50% was enough.
Right.
Neither one of these guys is going to get to 50. Neither one of these guys is going to get to 45.
Right.
So what does that mean? That means that between 15 and 20% of Americans are going to vote for someone they don't like. And those double doubters, I call them, double haters, other people call them, are going to have to vote for someone that they don't approve of. And that leads into the other reason I think the polls are garbage, is because for the first time in 30 years in the US, we're going to have a big third-party candidate.
Right.
And the third-party candidate, there's a couple of them, but they're now taking votes away for that exact demographic, those double hater people I talked about. Joe Biden won those voters by 12 points. They basically gave him the presidency. And right now, that's the exact demographic where Kennedy is doing the best.
Right.
And so,
That's Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yes. The Kennedys will be around in American politics forever.
Right. Even one who's been denounced by the rest of
the entire family. The entire family.
Right. So you touched on this just a few minutes ago. This is not a phenomena unique to Joe Biden.
No.
As we know, almost 50% of the world's population has or will be voting in national elections this year. And many, as you say, incumbents are deeply unpopular. According to some polls, every leader of a group of 7 nations has a higher disapproval rating than an approval rating, which I think is fascinating. Now, you and your firm work on political campaigns and advise governments all over the world. What do you think is driving such deep levels of discontent?
2 things. In a post-COVID economic world, let's be honest, voters, it's tough out there for people. And this is the first generation, at least in America, where voters no longer believe that their kids' generation is going to be better than theirs. The American dream that we always talked about, voters aren't sure it's there. That is true all over the place. And what we're seeing in world politics is migration has become the biggest issue in world politics. You saw right-wing governments win a stunning election that no poll showed in the Netherlands a couple months ago. You're seeing rising of extremism on the left and the right. Major parties in Europe, Latin America, and Asia are going down. third and fourth and fifth political parties are going up. There's real anger out there that what you and I would have considered be fringe candidates are tapping into. And Mark, they're winning elections.
Right.
Winning elections that people, AMLO in Mexico wasn't part of a party, Wilders in Netherlands, Milei in Argentina, Italy. Those people are winning these elections now. And it's partially because of immigration. It's a lot about economic dislocation, and they're not sure what the future is. And then some of it, honestly, is our bifurcated social media. When I was coming up in politics, I was taught, you control the narrative, you win the campaign. In the age of social media, it is really hard to control a narrative.
Right.
We used to talk about the bully pulpit in American politics. The president went out and gave a speech and defined the message. And that's just not true anymore. And so it makes it really hard to get out to voters what you're doing. And to your point, incumbents are struggling with this all over the world. And that's true here this week in my meetings. Governments around the world are trying to figure out how to talk to citizens in a new way. What are the technologies you use? How do you tell people what you're doing? And I think that stuff is changing a lot.
Right. I mean, when Joe Biden was elected in 2020, TikTok, did it exist?
I think it had just started, but no one knew what it was.
But no one knew what it was.
Right. And this election will be what I call the TikTok election.
Right.
The most used platform in America for political discourse is TikTok. And, that didn't even exist. Barack Obama won a presidency with Facebook. I remember on election night 2008, we sent out one tweet for the Obama campaign because we thought it was a stupid technology that would never go anywhere. And like 4 years later, we used it every day. And, so people say, Jim, what's your advice? And my advice is data matters. Having big data, there are many platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, text, TV, but what you need is data. And that's true in our corporate work too. You need to figure out how to target the right consumers, target the right voters. And I think it'll be interesting to see how both campaigns are really doing that.
But as a student of political history in the US and elsewhere, how do you see the future when you touched on migration? Climate change is obviously driving some of this migration patterns.
Yep.
Because it's causing conflict. People are trying to leave conflict. It will change the economic conditions, the ability of people to earn money in ways that I think will be profound. Technology that's fueled this rise of populism. Technology kind of turbocharges everything.
Yep.
Are we in a cycle that is going to continue, where essentially things just get worse and worse? Well,
God,
why should I not be depressed about the state of the world?
let me make you a little calmer. So at heart, I'm an optimist. And I believe when you look at the overall trends, the trend lines are good. More people around the world are getting education, less people in poverty. Bill Gates gives this great speech about, if you look at the data, there's never been a better time to be alive than right now.
Sure.
And you and I know from your history in journalism and mine in politics that we've been through this before. We went through this in the muckraker days in the 1920s. We had great strife in the 50s and 60s during the social movements. We've been through the Vietnam War. We went through that and came out the other side. I think in the end, probably technology, which I agree with you, is probably the cause of some of this, is probably going to be the thing that fixes it too. We have amazing innovation going on. Yesterday I toured or talked to folks here who are building the first large language model in Arabic in Doha.
Fascinating.
They'll find new ways to communicate with people. They'll do really cool things. There's a lot of experiments right now going on the ground. It's making people start to have different kinds of conversations. And so I think we'll iterate out of this. Is it bumpy right now? Absolutely. But am I inherently an optimist that the arc of history is getting better? I think that's what the data says. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us. You're in this room at 4 o'clock, separated from getting a cold drink, hearing me talk because you care about these issues. And 2 billion people around the world are going to vote this year, over 70 countries. This will be the biggest year for democracy ever. And that just has to make me optimistic.
One of the things that occurs to me about social media, and particularly in the TikTok age, is that it kind of erases any sense of history. So, for example, Biden seems to be losing support among younger voters in many cases because of his support of Israel in its war in Gaza. That's prompted a huge number of demonstrations, I think, as we all know, on American college campuses, for example. But his opponent, Donald Trump, tried to implement a ban on Muslims from many countries and is arguably a much stronger supporter of Bibi Netanyahu than Biden is. So how do you explain this kind of amnesia, and amnesia about kind of what the Donald Trump presidency was like for many people?
So I used to say to President Obama almost every day, if this election is a choice between you and your opponent, you will win. If it's a referendum on the incumbents usually lose because of the numbers you and I talked about. The Biden campaign has not yet and is starting to drive that contrast. You have the best example, which is under 5% of young voters know that Donald Trump favors a ban on Muslims. What campaigns do is tell people about that. We are in an age of cynicism about politics, cynicism about life, and you feel that on social media. You see that every day. And it's why my advice to campaigns all the time is get surrogates, get people who look like voters, who talk like voters, who are their age, to start pointing some of this out. Is, an 80-year-old Joe Biden really going to do a TikTok and say, let me tell you, 18-year-old, why to vote? Probably not.
Right.
But if Taylor Swift did it,
Right.
that's a much different thing. If Beyonce did it, if local young people who are influencers do it. And so I think it just goes back to what you and I were talking about. Using the medium to get your message out, I think is really, really important, and driving that contrast. Both campaigns have got to figure out how to make it more about the other candidate. And once that contrast happens, because if you just look at the actual numbers, Joe Biden should be doing much better with younger voters. Since the Dobbs decision, Donald Trump should be doing much better with women voters, and his numbers have gone down. So they both have got to figure out what to do to drive those contrasts.
So I know you are a major Swiftie.
I am a Swiftie.
Do you think there's a chance that she might be persuaded to endorse Donald Trump?
Well,
Joe Biden.
Well, she's already.
Would you advise that?
Well, I would beg her to do it.
Beg her to do
yes,
it, right.
Yes. I would offer to be her staffer for free if she would do it. And I'm very expensive, so no, I'm kidding. I think she's already taken some steps. She just did a rally in the Midwestern states, and she registered over 40,000 voters in one concert. That is a very big deal.
Right.
She has been involved in politics before. What she will do, that's her decision. But, Barack Obama won in part because of the amazing surrogates who campaigned for him. You could argue that the most powerful endorsement he got was Oprah. Right. When no one thought Barack Obama could win, Oprah endorsed him. And that was the beginning of kind of saying, oh my God, this guy could win. So, I know we joke about Taylor, but these surrogates in this age of cynicism really do matter. And when you ask people, how they're thinking about what to vote, they literally say, what are other people doing? What are my friends and family doing? And it's important to run a campaign that reflects that.
Your firm, the Messina Group, recently took a stake in another advisory group, which is called Global Counsel. It has offices in many places around the world, including here in Doha.
Yep.
Right? So how are you advising these different clients around the world to think about how they should cope with the challenges that we've just been talking about around migration, technology, et cetera? Is there some common theme to how you approach the advice that you're giving those clients?
Yeah, especially in the kind of corporate sector with our corporate clients. Why I'm in Doha, because we just made this investment in Global Counsel, in my opinion, the best firm in Europe and the Middle East. In part, I did it because I think the next decade for companies will be decided on this line of where regulation hits innovation. You know, and you all know this in this room, governments are going to regulate, governments are going to help, governments are going to hurt, governments are going to be a part of our future because of things like migration, climate change, economic development. And so you need a trusted partner. And I want to build a worldwide practice that can say to, you know, Mark, the CEO of Markco, like, you have problems all over the world, I can help you everywhere. And here's why, because, you know, you don't want help in one place or the other place. You want someone who can sit with you and say, how do you deal with social media? How do you deal with data? How do you deal with governments? And so that's the kind of work we're going to do with Global Counsel. And, you know, in my time here with the staff and talking to all the amazing leaders that are at this conference, you know, people want to work together. People understand that this is a connected world, right, and we all have to take these challenges on together.
So let's go back to where we started this conversation. Who will be the next president of the United States?
So my prediction, I hate to, I'm not going to dodge, but I'm going to tell you this is going to be the closest election in American history. We didn't know for several days last time. I think we're likely going to be closer. Remember that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the closest 3 states by 70,000 votes. Biden beat Trump in the closest 3 states by about 250,000 votes.
Right.
It is likely going to be even closer than that because of the third parties we talked about. You know, if I was playing poker, I think you'd rather nominally have Biden's cards than you would Trump's cards. Just given the swing states, it's probably easier for Biden to win Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, which gets him enough to win it all, than it is for Trump to win those states. But it's going to be incredibly close. And I think, and that's true in all the races we're working on around the world. It's just, you know, we are divided right now and we're going through a tough time, but I think we'll innovate out of it. And, you know, we'll be watching in 174 days to see who the president of the United States of America is.
That is a bit of a dodge, but I'll let you get away with it. All right, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you very much.